The courtroom had always been his kingdom. The polished wood, the echo of footsteps on the tiled floor, the heavy silence that fell whenever he entered. It all fed into the image he had built for himself. A man of the law. A man who thought the rules were bent for him. His badge, though not always pinned to his chest, seemed to hang invisibly wherever he went, like an invisible shield against doubt, against judgment, against consequence. For years, it had worked. People looked at him and saw authority. They saw someone who could not be touched. He lived in that illusion long enough to believe it was the truth. But this story does not begin inside the courtroom. It begins on a quiet street, where life seemed as ordinary as it could be. Families walked dogs, children rode their bikes on cracked sidewalks, and porch lights flickered on as dusk settled. Behind the facades of neat lawns and trimmed hedges, there were lives, complicated, fragile, sometimes broken. He lived among them, blending in like any other man who carried his secrets carefully. He was respected, even envied. He drove a clean car, kept his shirts pressed, and nodded to neighbors like someone who had nothing to hide. That was his power. People believed the surface. They rarely looked deeper. The woman who would change everything also walked among these same streets, though she never felt like she belonged there. She moved quietly, her life a patchwork of survival and resilience. To outsiders, she was nothing remarkable, just another face, another voice that blended into the everyday hum. But beneath that calm, she carried the weight of experiences that had hardened her. She knew how to read people, how to sense danger before it struck. She had learned not to be fooled by polished smiles or the comfort of uniforms. She had learned that power, when placed in the wrong hands, was more dangerous than a weapon. Town itself wore a mask. To anyone passing through, it looked safe, predictable, a place where rules mattered and order was respected. Courthouses stood tall and proud, schools let out children with backpacks bouncing, and local diners buzzed with chatter about the weather and work. But every small town has its shadows, and in this one, the shadows stretched long. Behind closed doors, marriages cracked under pressure, money controlled conversations, and those with power kept their grip tight. Whispers of corruption had floated around for years, but whispers never carried far enough to break walls built by fear. He was one of those walls. For a long time his badge was enough to keep suspicion at bay. The way he held himself, the sharpness of his words, the confidence in his step, it all said he was untouchable. And people wanted to believe it. They wanted to think that the ones meant to protect them truly did. They wanted to believe the law was clean. But he knew the law was a tool, and tools could be twisted, reshaped, used to build or to destroy. He had already chosen which way to use it. In the beginning, there was no sign of what was coming. To anyone watching, life played out as it always had. He worked, smiled in the right places, and shook hands when it served him. She worked too, kept to herself, never asking for more than her small piece of peace. Their worlds should never have crossed, but in towns like this, paths are rarely far apart. And when they finally met, it was not by chance. It was the beginning of something that looked at first like routine. But beneath the surface, a storm had already started gathering. She saw it before others did. In the way he spoke, in the way he leaned on his position, as if it gave him the right to control. At first it was small. A comment that made her uneasy, a glance that lingered too long, an expectation that felt heavier than it should. She told herself not to overthink it. Men like him carried themselves with arrogance, but arrogance wasn't always dangerous. Still, something in her warned her not to trust the mask he wore. Something about his confidence didn't feel like strength. It felt like cover. For him, control was a quiet hunger. It lived in him long before she walked into his life. The badge gave him excuses, gave him doors to walk through that others couldn't. It allowed him to believe he deserved obedience, silence, and fear. And in the courtroom, where his voice could shift the future of another human being, he fed that hunger like a man who never knew fullness. Yet, outside those walls, when it came to her, his hunger was different. It was personal. It wasn't about law or justice. It was about bending her until she broke. What neither of them knew then was how quickly things would spiral. The small cracks that went unnoticed in the beginning would widen until they swallowed them both. She would not bow to him the way others did, and that defiance would cut deeper than he expected. In the weeks to come, she would force him into a battle he had never fought before, a battle where his badge, his pride, and his courtroom tricks would not be enough to save him. And so, as the town slept under porch lights and the courthouse locked its doors for the night, the stage was set. A man convinced he was beyond consequence. A woman unwilling to be silenced. A world that appeared ordinary, yet fragile, teetering on the edge of fracture. No one knew it yet, but the quiet streets and tidy houses would soon hold the echoes of a story that would leer, with them all questioning just how much power one person should ever hold. It began with words, sharp, cutting, and meant to remind her of where he believed she stood. At first it was small, the kind of thing most people might brush aside. A comment about her being ungrateful, a warning hidden inside a joke, a reminder that she should be careful about who she crossed. But the way he said it, with that quiet smirk that carried both threat and pride, made it impossible to ignore. She could feel the control seeping into every conversation, every glance. He wanted her to know he was watching, that her choices were not hers alone. She tried to distance herself, but in a town where everyone knew everyone, there was no true escape. He turned up where she least expected, at her workplace, at the diner she liked, even on the street when she was walking home. At first, he used his badge as an excuse, asking questions that didn't need answers, acting as though he had the right to know her business. But soon, it stopped being about official matters. His questions became personal. Who she spent time with. Why hadn't she answered his calls? Why did she look at him as if he wasn't in control? His pride couldn't handle her defiance. The more she resisted, the harder he pushed. He wasn't used to hearing the word no, especially not from someone he saw as beneath him. For years, he had lived in a world where people bowed to authority, where his voice was enough to decide guilt or innocence. She disrupted that balance, and it drove him into a dangerous place. What started as arrogance began to twist into obsession. He didn't just want control anymore. He needed to prove to himself that he still had it. The people around them noticed something shifting, though no one dared to speak it aloud. Neighbors who once saw him as the respectable man of the law now whispered about his temper. Co-workers caught the edge in his tone when her name came up. She too carried the weight of whispers. Some pitied her, some blamed her, and some simply told her to let it go and not make trouble. In towns like this, silence was often safer than truth. And that silence worked in his favor. It gave him room to tighten his grip. Behind closed doors, his life wasn't as polished as it looked. The courtroom respect, the nods of approval from higher-ups, it all hid a mess he couldn't control. He was drowning in debt, spending money he didn't have to keep up an image of success. His marriage, once a quiet arrangement, was fraying at the seams. His wife had stopped asking where he was at night, and his children, if they noticed at all, had learned not to question the cold distance in their father's eyes. Power at work filled the gaps left by chaos at home. And when she came into his life, he saw her not as a person, but as a distraction, a way to reassert the control slipping from every other part of his world. She, on the other hand, carried her own ghosts. She had grown up in a house where silence was survival, where speaking against men in power brought nothing but pain. That history made her strong, but it also made her wary. She recognized his behavior for what it was, because she had lived through it before, and she promised herself she would not go through it again. Yet the more she pushed back, the more dangerous it became. He was not like the men she had faced before. He had a badge. He had influence. He could turn her defiance into a weapon against her. Some moments made her question her own safety. The time she found her car tires slashed, though no one saw who did it. The late-night calls where no one spoke on the other end, but she knew who it was. The papers filed against her in court, thinly veiled under legal jargon, were designed to intimidate and drain her. He was using every tool he had, twisting the law until it bent into something personal. Each move wasn't just about control, it was about breaking her spirit piece by piece. But what he didn't expect was her resilience. Instead of crumbling, she grew sharper. She documented everything. She confided in a small circle of people she trusted, even though they warned her of the risks. She kept records, saved messages, and noted every strange encounter. She knew the danger wasn't just in what he said or did. It was in the way he believed no one would ever believe her over him. And maybe he was right. Maybe most wouldn't. But she was determined to make sure his mask eventually slipped. As tensions built between them, the cracks in his public image grew wider. Rumors reached the courthouse, though no one confronted him directly. His colleagues saw him snapping at small mistakes, raising his voice in meetings, and drinking too much at gatherings where he once held perfect composure. At home, the distance became unbearable. His wife, tired of the secrets and the bitterness, began making her own quiet plans. She no longer feared him the way others did. She simply wanted out. That betrayal, though unspoken, only fueled his rage. To him, everything was slipping. His finances, his marriage, his reputation. And she became the target where all his frustrations landed. One night, during a confrontation that should have been simple, his anger erupted in a way that left her shaken for days. He stood too close, his words laced with venom, his hands twitching like he was one step away from crossing a line he couldn't take back. She didn't give him the satisfaction of fear on her face, but inside, she knew the situation had reached a dangerous place. He was no longer satisfied with control through words or paper. He wanted more. He wanted proof of his power, something he could hold on to when everything else was crumbling. The town, oblivious on the surface, was living with an undercurrent of unease. People sensed something was wrong. Some avoided the subject, pretending not to notice. Others gossiped in hushed tones, not realizing how close things were to exploding. The stage was no longer just set. It was shaking under the weight of pressure that had nowhere else to go. For him, obsession was no longer a shadow in the background. It consumed him. He began to believe that if he couldn't control her, he would lose everything that made him who he was. For her, the fight was no longer just about survival. It became about truth, about refusing to let someone with power destroy her life in silence. Two people, locked in a battle neither asked for, were now circling closer to a breaking point. And as the days turned into weeks, it became clear to both of them that this would not end quietly. One of them would have to give in, or one of them would have to fall. The night it happened was colder than it should have been. The streets were damp, reflecting the glow of weak streetlights, and the air carried that sharp silence that made every sound louder than it really was. She had tried to go about her evening as if it were any other, but there was a heaviness in her chest, an instinct that told her this night would not end like the others. She had learned to trust those instincts. They had saved her before. Still, she couldn't have known how far he was willing to go. He had been unraveling for weeks, pacing the walls of his home like a man hunted by his own demons. His debts piled higher, his marriage had become little more than a battlefield of silence, and whispers of his temper at work had started to circle closer. But none of that cut him as deeply as her defiance. He had convinced himself that if he could just force her into submission, if he could break her spirit, then the world would feel steady again. The badge, the courtroom, the image of respect, they meant nothing if she continued to stand in the one place where he demanded power and refused to give it. He followed her that night. The tires of his car hummed low as he kept just enough distance not to be noticed. His hands gripped the wheel too tightly, his knuckles pale, his mind racing with thoughts that tangled into one conclusion. It had to end. Whether it was anger or desperation that drove him, even he wasn't sure anymore. He just knew that watching her slip from his control felt like watching himself disappear. She sensed him before she saw him. Maybe it was the sound of his car slowing at the corner. Maybe it was just the heavy pull of dread pressing on her back. When she turned and saw the familiar shape of his figure in the dark, her stomach dropped. This wasn't another passing encounter. This wasn't him throwing words like stones and walking away. His eyes, lit by the street lamp, were wild and unsteady, and in that instant she knew. He was here for more than intimidation. The street was quiet, too quiet. Houses lined the block, but curtains were drawn, lights off, the world tucked safely into bed. There would be no witnesses, no one to hear her voice if it rose into a scream. She stood her ground anyway. Running would mean giving him the satisfaction of fear. She had promised herself she would not bow. Her hands trembled, but her face stayed steady. "Go home," she told him, her voice sharp, steady, louder than she felt. But her words only seemed to ignite something in him. He stepped closer, his jaw tight, his voice low and cracked with fury. He told her she had ruined him, that she had no idea the damage she had done, that everything was falling apart because of her. The words tumbled out like a storm, half-formed accusations mixed with the bitterness of a man who had lost his grip on the world. She tried to reason, to steady her own voice, but reason no longer had a place here. He wasn't listening. He was drowning in the chaos of his own mind. When he reached for her, it was fast, clumsy, not the confident grip of a man in control, but the desperate clutch of someone on the edge. She fought back, her nails digging, her body twisting to get free. The struggle spilled onto the pavement, the sound of their movements breaking the stillness of the night. She cried out, not just in fear but in defiance, and for a moment it was enough to make him falter. But then his rage surged again, stronger, darker. The crime itself was not clean. It was messy, raw, born out of the collision of anger and fear. His hands shook as he pinned her down, his breath ragged, his mind spinning between guilt and determination. He told himself it wasn't murder, not really. He told himself it was justice, it was punishment. It was the only way to silence the voice that had haunted him. But as his actions grew more violent, there was no hiding from the truth. He was crossing a line he could never return from. In her last moments, she fought with everything she had, not just against him, but against the fate he had chosen for her. Her thoughts raced, of the people she loved, of the life she had tried to build, of the simple peace she had wanted. There was fear, yes, but there was also defiance. The same defiance that had driven her from the beginning. She would not give him the satisfaction of breaking her spirit, even if he took her life. When it was over, the silence was unbearable. He stood above her, chest heaving, his hands trembling with the weight of what he had done. The street around him was still the same, quiet and empty, but the world had shifted. He had destroyed the illusion of being untouchable. In the dim glow of the streetlight, he saw not power, but ruin staring back at him. Panic hit him in waves. His mind scrambled, trying to piece together a plan. He checked her pulse, though he already knew the truth. His hands shook as he dragged her body off the street, his breath catching in his throat. Every sound seemed magnified, the crunch of gravel under his shoes, the rustle of fabric, the pounding of his heart. He told himself he could still control this, that he could cover it up the way he had covered up so many other wrongs. But deep down he knew this was not a mistake that could be buried. His thoughts flipped between denial and cold calculation. He replayed the moment again and again, convincing himself it was her fault, that she had pushed him too far, that she had left him no choice. But even as he tried to believe it, the image of her eyes, defiant even in her final breath, burned into him. He had silenced her body, but her spirit lingered, echoing louder than any words she had spoken. As he stumbled back to his car, his breath still ragged, his body trembling, he felt the weight of what he had done pressed down like a stone he could never lift. The badge that once made him feel untouchable was useless now. No courtroom, no connections, no whispered deals would erase this night. He had crossed the line between power and destruction, and there was no going back. The street remained quiet, the world still asleep, unaware of the crime that had unfolded in its shadows. But the silence was deceptive. Because soon the truth would begin to crack through, and the man who thought himself untouchable would learn what it meant to face the weight of justice, not from a courtroom he controlled, but from the reality he could no longer escape. The morning after the crime, the town woke to a silence that felt heavier than usual. People went about their routines. Children walked to school. The smell of coffee filled kitchens. Radios hummed with morning news. But beneath it all was a strange undercurrent, as though something unseen had cracked. When her absence was first noticed, it was brushed off. Maybe she was late. Maybe she had left early. But those who knew her best felt unease settling in their stomachs. She wasn't the kind of woman who vanished without a word. For him, the hours that followed were suffocating. He sat alone in his car, hands trembling, eyes staring blankly at the windshield. Every sound, the ring of a phone, the scrape of a door opening, the bark of a dog, felt amplified, like the world was mocking him with reminders of life continuing while he was drowning. He told himself lies in rapid succession. It wasn't his fault. She had provoked him. No one would believe her side anyway. Then the lies turned into plans. Maybe he could hide it. Maybe his connections would shield him, like they always had. He clung to his badge as if it still meant protection, as if it still had power. But no matter how many times he whispered those reassurances, the image of her face, the sound of her last struggle, cut through him like a blade. The guilt came in waves he couldn't control. At moments it was sharp and unbearable. At others, he numbed himself, convincing his mind to focus on logistics, where he had left her, how to explain his movements, how to erase what had already been done. But deep inside he knew nothing could erase it. For the first time in his life he felt small, untouchable, no longer fit. He was broken, exposed, and terrified. Her family's world collapsed the instant her disappearance became official. Calls went unanswered, messages piled up with no reply, and dread grew into desperation. They retraced her steps, spoke to friends, and knocked on doors. The police, his colleagues, filed the report with little urgency at first. Missing adults often turn up, they said. Maybe she left on her own. Maybe there was nothing sinister at all. But her family knew better. She was cautious, dependable, and grounded. She didn't just disappear. And when whispers began to circulate about who had last been seen with her, about who had been circling her life like a shadow, those closest to her knew where to point their fear. The town, once eager to look at him as a man of the law, began to shift in its perception. At first, people clung to denial. He was respectable, they said. He had worked cases, put criminals behind bars. He wasn't perfect, but he wasn't capable of something like this. Yet as days stretched into weeks and the investigation deepened, cracks in his reputation began to show. Stories that had been quietly buried surfaced, moments of anger, questionable decisions, times he had leaned too heavily on his badge to get what he wanted. The man once admired began to look less like a protector, and more like a predator hiding. In plain sight, her friends, devastated, carried guilt of their own. Some remembered warnings she had shared, little moments when she confided in them about his behavior. They had told her to be careful, but had they told her enough? Had they stood by her when she needed them most? Those questions became wounds that would not heal, replaying endlessly in their minds. And for her family, grief was mixed with rage. They mourned her absence, but they also burned with the need for justice. To them, she was not just another victim. She was their daughter, their sister, their friend, silenced by a man who thought himself above consequence. The media eventually caught wind of the story, and once it broke, it spread quickly. Headlines painted him as the fallen officer, the man who let power twist into obsession. Reporters dug through his past, uncovering financial troubles, marital strain, and disciplinary warnings that had never been taken seriously. Each revelation painted a picture of a man spiraling long before that night, a man whose badge had shielded him until it didn't. Public opinion swung fast. People who had once defended him now distanced themselves, unwilling to be tied to his downfall. The courtroom, once his stronghold, became a place of shame. For the town, the crime left a scar that would not fade. Parents looked at their children differently, warning them to trust less easily, to be cautious even with those who wore uniforms. Neighbors who once waved warmly now watched each other with suspicion. The illusion of safety, of order, had shattered. The courthouse, once a symbol of justice, stood as a reminder of betrayal. Trust, once broken, could not be rebuilt so easily. For him, the walls closed in quickly. Each day was a blur of fear and regret. He replayed the night in his head endlessly, sometimes convincing himself he had been justified, other times breaking down under the weight of guilt. He could not escape the image of her defiance, the way she had refused to bow even as he tried to destroy her. It haunted him day and night, a voice louder than any courtroom gavel. He began to crumble under the pressure, no longer the confident man who had once strutted through town, but a hollow shell waiting for the inevitable. Her memory, however, grew stronger in the voices of those who loved her. Vigils were held, candles lit, photographs of her smiling face placed against courthouse steps. Her story was shared, not just as tragedy, but as a warning of what happens when power is left unchecked, when silence is chosen over truth. People spoke her name with both sorrow and pride, determined that she would not be forgotten. In the end, the aftermath was not just about him or her. It was about a community forced to face the darkness within itself. It was about family members who would never stop grieving, friends who carried the weight of guilt, and neighbors who would never look at authority the same way again. It was about the shattering of illusions and the painful reminder that evil does not always wear the face of a stranger. Sometimes it smiles, shakes your hand, and hides behind a badge. The crime had ended her life, but its echo stretched far beyond that night, reshaping everyone it touched. And for him, the man who thought himself untouchable, there was no more running. The world he had built on lies and control was crumbling, piece by piece, leaving only the truth, and the silence of a woman who refused to be broken, even in death. The trial became the turning point, not just for him, but for everyone whose life had been tangled in the crime. The courtroom where he had once thrived now stood against him, its silence no longer one of respect, but of judgment. Every step he took inside those walls felt like a reminder of what he had lost, of the power that had slipped through his hands the night he took her life. The badge that once shielded him became evidence of how far he had fallen, a symbol of arrogance that had led him here. He was no longer a man of authority. He was the accused, stripped bare before the very system he had once manipulated. The evidence against him was undeniable. Witness statements, records of his harassment, the trail of intimidation she had carefully documented, all of it painted a picture that could no longer be denied. Her defiance in life had followed him into death, her voice living on through the proof she had left behind. As prosecutors laid out their case, it became clear that this was not a crime of passion, but a crime of obsession, of control twisted beyond reason. And for once, the law did not bend to him. The verdict brought with it a heavy silence, followed by a release of emotion from those who had waited too long for justice. Guilty. The word carried weight. It was not victory. It could never replace her, could never heal the wound, but it was acknowledgement. It was proof that even those who hide behind power cannot escape forever. He was sentenced, his future erased by the very system he had once believed was his to command. His life, once built on arrogance, crumbled into years behind bars, where power meant nothing. For her family, the outcome was bittersweet. Justice had been served, but the emptiness remained. No sentence could bring back the woman they loved, the laughter that once filled their homes, the steady presence she had given them. They mourned her every day, even as they found strength in knowing she had not died in silence. Her courage had exposed him, had broken the illusion of untouchability he had worn for so long. She had fought back in life, and even in death, she had not allowed him to erase her truth. The community, too, was forced to confront its own silence. For years, people had looked away from the warning signs, from the whispers of his temper and his abuse of power. They had convinced themselves it was safer not to ask questions, not to challenge someone in authority. But her death left them with guilt and reflection. They realized the danger of turning away, the cost of ignoring what is uncomfortable. Slowly, conversations began. About accountability, about power, about what it means to truly protect one another. The media framed the case as a cautionary tale. Headlines spoke of a man destroyed by his own arrogance, of a woman whose defiance brought justice even in tragedy. Debates rose about the misuse of power, about the protections that failed her, about the culture of silence that allowed him to thrive for so long. The story became bigger than the town. It became a reflection of society's struggle with authority, with gender, with the imbalance that allows one person to hold so much control over another. In prison, he lived out the consequences of his actions. Stripped of respect, he became just another inmate, haunted by the memory of what he had done. His arrogance faded, replaced by the kind of hollow silence that comes when there is nothing left to cling to. He tried at times to justify his actions to himself, but the justifications never held. Deep down, he knew he had destroyed not only her life, but his own, along with the trust of a community that would never forgive him. Her story, however, lived on. Vigils continued. Awareness campaigns were started in her name, and her family worked tirelessly to ensure her legacy was not defined only by her death, but by her strength. She became a symbol of resilience, of the need to speak out against abuse of power, of the importance of standing firm even in the face of intimidation. For many, her life became a reminder that one voice, though silenced, could still spark change. The broader impact of the crime was undeniable. It forced questions about morality, about the fragility of justice, and about the ease with which power can corrupt. It showed how authority, when unchecked, can become a weapon rather than a shield, and it highlighted the complexity of human behavior, the way fear, pride, obsession, and defiance can collide in ways that destroy lives. At its heart, the story was not just about a crime. It was about the consequences of silence, the weight of arrogance, and the resilience of truth. It showed that justice, though delayed and imperfect, can still rise from tragedy. It reminded everyone that morality is not a matter of titles or uniforms, but of choices, and that those choices define who we are when the mask of respectability is stripped away. In the end, the man who thought his badge made him untouchable learned the hardest truth of all. No one is beyond consequence. And the woman he tried to silence proved, even in death, that courage can outlast fear, and truth can outlive power.